Welcome everyone. We are now recording. So welcome to our weekly call. You'll see I was feeling artistic at the weekend, or creative with my generative AI prompts at least. Fancy a little bit of graffiti style art for a change. So as you can see, the focus for our call this week, which I'll hand over to Colin in a moment, is addressing fraud as an accessibility issue using DNS text records. And some of you may have seen the short video that Colin recorded on the topic by way of a lead-in, and we also sort of touched on it very briefly on the call last week. Prior to that, though, just a thank you to our sponsors, DNS OARC, whose support for the call, as always, is very much appreciated. So thank you to the DNS OARC team and community. So as I say, I'll hand over to Colin in a second to talk about the sort of theme for the call. As always, be plenty of time for a discussion on that. And then I'll go through some of the recent developments from the last week, of which there seemed to be a surprisingly large number. There was a lot of stuff, as you will see, particularly if you're on the mailing list for the weekly headlines this morning. If you're not want to be, just send me a message and I'll happily add you. We'll also touch on a few forthcoming events, and I'll remind you what our topics are for the next couple of calls or so. And we may have time for any other business at the end. We'll see, providing we're within the allotted hour. So hope that all makes sense. And without further ado, then let me firstly stop sharing. And say, Colin, thanks for joining. I think, from your LinkedIn profile, from the Blind Trust. So you might want to just explain a bit about that by way of introduction. Maybe you were planning to anyway, but it'd be intriguing to get that. And then, anyway, hand over to you and just talk through your idea.
I'll sort of come on to that in a moment. How do I present?
So see the share button, which should be towards the bottom of the Zoom window.
Yeah, yes, there we go.
Bottom middle on mine,
Okay.
but it might not be on
Yes,
yours.
yeah. Oh, well, let's make sure I share the right thing. Oh, application, Windows. Where's my PowerPoint? I haven't done a PowerPoint thing for a long time.
I should have said if it was easy, you could easily have mailed it to me, but apologies, I didn't think to say that. I would have
That's okay.
happily
Let me
tried.
just try presenting my PowerPoint and then going to Zoom. Zoom. Right, okay. I think that's
Something is
that
happening.
sharing.
Yay.
Yay.
Yeah, it's on the screen. If you press the little book-like symbol in the, that's worked.
Okay.
Whatever you just did is absolutely fine.
Yeah. Okay, so I don't have the chat in view. So I kind of want to keep this short. I'm hoping people will have seen the little 2 minute thing I did last week, and kind of want to get into what the potential limitations, security risk, the things that I haven't considered. I've been looking in and around this for a while now, but let's just try and storm through some bits if I can. So I'm trying to fix the internet, is what I say, and that all my friends think it's quite an amusing thing to claim. I have a book actually from Jimmy Wales that he signed, Good Luck Fixing the Internet. Got to start with a joke about DNS, but it might take you 24 hours to get it. Yeah, people think DNS is really kind of basic. We know a little bit more than that. There's a lot more going on than people think, as is true with the internet or the web. I would say most people have no capacity to understand what is going on when they're using the internet. They don't know how the fuel injectors work in the car. They don't know how the cells are balanced in an electric battery for electric vehicles. People think the padlock means trust, but browsers have deprecated padlocks mostly now, and advanced certification, advanced validation certs were never really a thing that took off, and certainly are no longer differentiated by the browser. I don't want to name names, but Lord Holmes has been fabulous at trying to encourage me to carry on doing this. I did my social engineering training with Kevin Mitnick back in the day. I actually socially engineered myself onto a course to do his social engineering course. I recruited all of the people onto his social engineering course by using social engineering techniques to get them there. Oddly, the Australian security community were very adverse to trying to allow an ex-criminal to make profit. And we sort of used to joke that most Australians are descended from ex-criminals, but having Australian family, I'm allowed to say that. There's elements of the work that I've been trying to do that come from some of what Moxie Marlinspike has tried to do, and I haven't been able to get through to Moxie to see why that didn't succeed. I think it's a 2009.
Is it just me, or is Colin frozen?
Typical global north, not an American centric type concept. So Leonie Watson of the WC3 tells me I really need two implementers, ideally browsers, before I can really get the WC3 to spin up a working group. Didn't really give any extra help after that. She herself is visually impaired, well, stroke blind. I tried to talk to Troy. Well, I did talk to Troy Hunt. I can send a video to people of me asking the question, saying, "Bill, I have been pwned with its verification string could become a very powerful trust signal if it referenced the domain that the trust signal was for, or the I have been pwned registration was for." Kieran Martin hosted that talk, and I did manage to talk to Kieran at a cyber show a year or so earlier, and he didn't give me quite the enthusiasm that I expected when he just said, "Good luck with that." Yeah, Google don't think that my accessibility project is an accessibility project, which I think is a little bit frustrating. I am quite good at getting to people at times, but I've not really been able to get to Microsoft. The people at Microsoft have inferred that it's like a car manufacturer asking to have better designed roundabouts. And in reality, I think that car manufacturers should input into the design of roundabouts because they're the users of roundabouts. Never mind. So I have been in and around tech for a long time. I got onto the internet pre it being called that, really. I was telnetting around doing anonymous FTP, crashing Apollo domain graphical workstations, which I noticed had a font editor on there. So I also tried to create a Braille font, but I was unable to print it out, which was a bit annoying because they only had a line printer and plotters connected, things that would take your arm off because of the speed they moved. But I'm going to kind of focus on the advertising aspect of my history. So I have worked at merchant banks. I have worked for Compaq. I have worked for Aslan, if anyone remembers Aslan back in the day, with the people that brought Novell into the UK. But my second job was in an advertising agency. My fourth job was in an advertising agency, and my last job was in yeah, none of the jobs in an advertising agency. I've done some SEO as well, grey hat stuff, trying to make it white hat. But my last 10 years or so was in publishing, doing ad tech at very large scale. So 10 billion monthly ad impressions, kind of the scale of Facebook, really. We had lots of adjacent content where our content was licensed, running on socials. Uh, and if ever it was seen, in a team, very small team, four of us, we were doing all of the commercial ad integrations. We were getting lots of complaints coming in. We weren't allowed to bite the hand that fed us. We were seeing all of our revenue being taken away by the networks, the big networks, but we were always to blame for the inappropriate content out there. So when I was made redundant, I thought I'd try and fix it. Um, we I mean, we had done some amazing work in the area as well. We created an ad reporting function, the sort of first of its kind for publishers. We got involved with the ASAs and their scam alert initiative. I was the only non-lawyer present at the Advertising Standards Authority's IAB hosted event with all the chief legal counsels of Alphabet, Meta, of course for the UK, ByteDance, Taboola, Twitter, all of the big networks and a lot of little ones. And I did get somewhat frustrated when they said they were doing everything within their power to keep fraud within reasonable tolerances. And I was like, for organizations of your scale, even a single fraudulent impression is too many because of the life-changing harms that causes to a little old lady who loses her life savings and people with disabilities who are utterly dependent upon these devices. Just a random text message to them can be devastating. So what was I going to do about it? Well, for another project for a friend, I came up with the name Where Did It All Go Wrong? And I kept it because I just loved it. So I already had that, but it wasn't very compelling. Um, so to try and consider how to do things, I had done some training well, I did my degree in postgrad in urban planning and urban planning implementation. And it was very much about trying to put yourself in other people's places. When people talk about doing stakeholder consultation, I get annoyed because I'm just like, that means you're not doing proper consultation. You're not actually speaking to everyone. You're just cherry picking those that shout the loudest. If you're doing proper consultation, you'll use some research strategies. These are all the things that we were taught in the between 88 and 91. So the social model of disability as well, which posits that people who have disabilities only feel that they have a disability because of society's failure to adapt to their needs. And one of the key tenets of that is nothing for us without us. So one of the parts about doing trying to address fraud as an accessibility issue is I've come up with a vast array of approaches and considerations, but I never thought it was going to take me this long to get this far. Or I really thought I'd be doing lots of consultation with lots of accessibility charities, blind charities. Blind is a pejorative term, by the way. You should be using visually impaired in the UK. It's always the minefield. But it's tricky because people don't understand what I'm talking about, to be fair. I hope some of you guys will, some of you people will shortly. So why was I doing this for the visually impaired? Well, that's my godmother. She was one of the very first people in the UK to get a guide dog. She had several of them. This was her picking up one of her early guide dogs, actually an AI enhanced photograph because it was cut off and the AI had to add the legs back in. But AIs are astonishing now for people with visual impairments because as a child, I would have to, well, not have to, I would take pleasure and delight in reading the newspaper with her and describing photos in a compelling manner. It's a picture of a beaming woman sat on a cloth-covered bench with a dog with a smile on its face, looking off camera, waiting to get a treat. Whereas most image extraction utilities of late would just be going, dog, woman, woman and dog type stuff. But now the AIs are able to give those type of descriptions. And now you can actually send photos to people who have full blindness because they can interact with them. It's astonishing. So that is providing the convergence that I've been promised my entire career as Novell and Netscape were calling the network the computer back in the early days, installing Novell group-wise around Europe with its universal inbox, running Lotus Notes installs. I was an email administrator, my first bit of career at migrating mainframe email systems to LAN-based email systems. CCmail was my system. And that's me. That's my godmother on the left. You can see some of my artwork on the wall there. I think I'm a bit in the Jackson Pollock type space. So yeah, improvements in accessibility are improvements for all. We were very much taught when I was doing my urban planning, the white male type audio intake. How do you possibly consider the use needs of the fair and equitable distribution of land resources for all users as opposed to just yourself? So we had to do a lot of consideration around what other people's needs would be. And some of that was around consultation, but it was also just about being a bit empathetic. So it did draw a certain type of a person. I've got some neurodiversity just diagnosed only sort of recently in the last few years, but it has, in the 80s, you didn't have neurodiversity. You were just full of energy. But one of the other things that came out of planning was defensible space, and the internet is not defensible space. I did my training academically around building communities. And while the internet has been an amazing tool to bring people together, it certainly isn't really a managed built environment that is at all defensible, because any device can connect to any device. And that is really not ideal. There's very little validation of those checks. The use of standards, as people really haven't implemented a lot of, the necessary DNS sec. BIMI has been mentioned on various calls of yours. If people started just having better governance and making governance produce tangible, testable, verifiable, accessible outcomes, then screen readers could ingest that. But not only screen readers for people with disabilities and visual impairments, ad tech could ingest that, the networks could ingest that. It would give you much better signaling. It would prevent the cloaking of content. So SWAT really is about using DNS text records to put things into a secondary channel that is outside of the web channel, because the HTTP, as soon as you make a connection to a server, that can be cloaked so easily. But if that information goes into DNS, then that's always available to be queried at speed and kind of how I want to do it. This is not a nice looking record example, but it's a sort of an example in clear text. How I want to do it and how I suggest doing it is with lots of data dictionaries. So the TBT 001 is around creating like key value pair type things. I know those aren't really necessary in text records, but also it's not a key value pair that will have been used, so it's available. And I want to merge lots of sort of taxonomies, ontologies, frameworks that are sort of pre-existing into a common sort of data dictionary, borrowing bits of schemas, company.org, whatever, into bits to create the numeric, so that that can then be translated across different territories, so that this is really designed to be accessible first, global second, global south is the really sort of key part. Um, there's I've done lots of work around trying to build out what it is that the key value pairs could be. That whois might be a nice part. I mean, whois got redacted because of GDPR concerns, because of the lack of consent of individuals when they were submitting their domain purchase information. It was never reliable in the first place. It wasn't good. Uh, this is a voluntary process. People would want to put, and it's again not people, it's companies as an approach to what is not about tracking people. It doesn't conceptually have the concept of tracking people. I mean, if you're a mom and pop company, then really you should probably be paying some tax. You should probably have a registered bank account. You should probably be have compliance things you need to do because you're posting things out. You have customs declarations. Yeah. But if you're a very large organization and you're sending out lots of emails, you're using URL shorteners, you're using QR codes, then all of those should be consolidated so that that domain you are using can be identified as one that you are using. So I want to move a lot of what's, potentially DNS prefetch and preload. Those should have always been in DNS. Why would they put in web documents? I guess why it's done. In the early days of the internet, there were less domains. People were using a lot more subdomaining. Want to put the potential commercial integrations that sites use into DNS. So they're whitelisted. So when you go to a site, and I'll show you most people here will probably be using NoScript to block sites, and I'm very strict with that. It's quite interesting. When I was at the publisher, I went for quite a while with a couple of browsers where I had no ad blocking and just let them run riot. And it was quite interesting what we'd see coming through, or what I'd see coming through, running lots of versions of different browsers. I want to see what potential DNS record types can be reused. Lot for location might be very useful, especially for the blind and visually impaired and people in wheelchairs. Lot could provide indoor positioning system type information. If DNS was open on wireless hotspots, as it used to be, or whatever we call them this day and age. I noticed from the talk you gave a couple of weeks back about interesting use of DNS text records, that on planes, DNS tends to be open. In the early days of the internet, me and my friends were trying to do tunneling out via DNS, but back then it wasn't heavy traffic that we were sending. It was just pulling very light emails, no images really. So some constraints really are potentially we need to move towards subdomains in order to get the DNS records. As a brand safety person at a very large publisher group with hundreds of brands, hundreds of sites, apps, Facebook instant articles, those are dead now apparently. Lots of other various commercial integration approaches. News has a very different brand safety positioning from sport or celebrities. If it was news.bbc.co.uk and sport.bbc.co.uk, BBC's not commercialised apart from outside of the UK, but then it's a bbc.com and I didn't work for the BBC, then you would be able to have different brand safety settings on those domains. You would be able to say sports is safer and good for a lower age than perhaps news is. We always had lots of interesting conundrums where a sports journalist would be writing stories about when a sports person had done something bad, and then all of a sudden the lighter brand safety that would be on sports sections would come into play or come into dispute because that should have been under news because it was about them doing something bad. So this is really addressing lots of these old issues that publishers have had, that the internet has had. Um, I want to ask this forum about potential sort of selectors, alignment issues as per DKIM, DMARC, SPF. Uh, the next page actually shows an interesting example. Uh, that protocol is very broadly aligned to what I'm looking at doing. Apparently, there's work by Tim Berners-Lee with pods and solid, but that's more about data storage. I only recently came across that. But my big thing is I really want to delegate things like .well known and security.txt, put those into DNS, delegate them off to a trustworthy host. What does it mean by trustworthy? I don't know. We'll come to that. It's a consultation concern. So that information is available when a resource is down. That information can be retrieved from a potentially, not retrieved from a potentially compromised web host. My big thing is web hosts are just so vulnerable. Why aren't we using DNS as a secondary channel out of band? I mean, this is my history as doing ISDN as the core communications route that we used in a lot of the mail systems. And the joy was that you had an out of band communication to control the channel, bring the channel up and down. And that's slightly off topic. So I use
Colin, sorry, before you move on, I know you can't see the chat, so a couple of queries or comments in the chat. One from Jim, who I know has had to drop off. It is there can be problems with lots of text records at the zone apex. And Patrick's added to that, putting a new text record at apex is strongly discouraged as per RFC 8552.
5.2.
And also from Patrick, which feel free to jump in and expand on, there was a P3P for the web and it died.
Yes, well, there's P3Ps. There's another IEE initiative at the moment, My Consent or something, that in my LinkedIn comments you'll see me referencing that, of going, I don't quite understand what's happened with P3P compact policies. There was a separate part to P3P. Yeah, but just because something failed previously doesn't mean it shouldn't be tried again.
Yeah. Any thoughts on why text records specifically rather than a new dedicated record type? Was there any?
No, I just thought that would involve recoding the bind as opposed to just use text records. So yes, I mean, this is part of the questioning I had. See, 2004 at ICE, not the American one, International Security Expo, whatever. I ended up chatting to someone who was very knowledgeable. And well, the joy is that DNS has a lot better privacy around it, and they were like, "Oh, DNS is actually one of the things that GDPR has kind of not really addressed or considered." And that's why I was wanting to talk about oblivious DNS, because the privacy with this only comes from the use of oblivious DNS. But the privacy is also that by doing the matching, it's very quickly on the selector bit. So I love Easy DMARC. I've met them at quite a few shows. And their DKIM checker would struggle with selectors. But they seem to have fixed it since I was asking them about it. Because I use Proton Mail as mine, and you can see it's not in there. list of sort of initial selectors. However, below that, you can't see. Easy DMARC was able to find my Proton Mail DKIM selector. So looking at these sort of record types, yes, so that's where, let me just stop sharing now. How do I do that? Stop sharing.
Yeah, that's worked.
So that's mostly it, and I tried not to rush too fast through there. Yes, there's a lot of potential issues with it. Perhaps the records could be brevious and point off to other sources. I did talk to Jimmy Wales, as I said, at the Trust Conference last year. I left one of the talks a bit early and found him sat signing books, but there was no one there buying books. So I went over and bought a book and chatted to him for 15, 20 minutes. I think someone like Wikipedia would be an amazing place to host terms and conditions, privacy policies. Microsoft's terms and conditions did take 3 hours, 45 minutes for a person with a screen reader to read. People do not have the capacity to enter into contracts that they're casually exposed to. The Black Mirror Joan is awful as fiction, but Disney, and most people, are you aware of the Disney case where a person in America was denied the ability to sue Disney because when his wife died at a Disney resort because he'd taken up done a trial of Disney Plus. He didn't take up the trial, but he did the trial twice. He never paid for it. It wouldn't pass under English law because there'd be no consideration. It would be a predatory contract, blah, blah, blah. However, he potentially had to go to arbitration because in the terms and conditions, it said all Disney properties were covered by this term, physical and digital. Yeah, so there's lots of ways around it. It would be very interesting. It hasn't cropped up before about the issues of text selectors. There were 300,000 domains being registered per day, according to well, there was one last week. Infoblock. DNS can handle 300,000 additions. The scaling of it is, the subdomaining by spammers and scammers. I mean, this is all about providing provenance for legitimate businesses. This is just mostly around legitimate businesses able to prove that they have done the compliance work, employed disabled, visually impaired people in their organizations, regulators to be able to employ people with visual impairments in their organizations, because people with visual impairments under the 2010 Equality Act are allowed to make demands upon organizations to make reasonable adjustments. This, I maintain, means that people with visual impairments are less prone to social engineering. You can't pull the wool over the eyes of people with visual impairments. They're allowed to say, make all of this paperwork you're giving me fully accessible. I am not able to digest hours worth of material. Provide that to me in a more accessible format. Scammers will not be able to do that. I mean, Ofcom is trying to issue fines against Pornhub and the likes, and is finding that they're not being paid because they're not answering their post at the Bermudan registered office. All of this would come to light in a beneficial ownership type registry that this would make in passing. So there's lots of intended, unintended consequences coming from this.
Well, maybe
it's just about improving transparency.
Well, that feels like a good opportunity then. I mean, as I say, there's been 2 or 3 comments in the chat. Let's maybe pause there and see if anyone's got any immediate thoughts, comments.
I can see the chat now.
Questions other than the obvious one. Well, Patrick, I know you raised the question about text records at the apex being discouraged. So anyone else got any thoughts or comments? Feel free to jump in.
I mean, PICS is another standard that would be very useful around age appropriateness at the moment, but abandoned.
Yeah.
just because something's been abandoned. I'd like to use stuff from SNMP. I'd like to borrow lots of different schema. I'd like to use XMBL, business markup things. I've done quite a lot of work at consolidating lots of these bits, but it's nothing for us without us. I can make suggestions, but I really want experts to be guiding and I want people with disabilities to be leading. And I really thought I'd be at that point now of working with lots of accessibility charities.
Well, there's a few people with certainly DNS expertise. Anyone wants to come in with any comments or?
Here's something, one of the considerations perhaps there needs to be for this potential additional DNS hierarchy that mirrors the current one that's used purely for trust. Then it's a true secondary channel, entirely separate from DNS. That's a lot easier than doing a Web 3.0 type implementation. Web 3.0, as far as I'm concerned, is energy expensive. It's all about tracking the individual. It's not always about tracking the individual, but the ability to track the individual is absolutely the key element of most Web 3.0 type solutions. And this is just a standard, not a commercial benefit. The only commercial benefit here is to employ visually impaired people in all sectors.
Okay, let's just see. So, anyone any thoughts, or do you want to ingest this and come back to Colin when you've had a chance to give it proper thought? Because I know it's quite information rich there. David, were you wanting to come in? Looks like just unmuted.
Thank you. Yes, I think it's a great idea to move towards an accessibility. So please take this as nothing but enthusiasm.
As a global top level because this is about trying to mimic the reverse PTR type record, but to do that for a trust indicator, because this is about matching two records. Any organization can be doing the matching, but that organization able to then set contractual relationships with the person where they are providing them with a trust anchor that will allow audit access, transparency guidelines. It's like B Corp, but without the enormous cost and with actual benefit, as opposed to that's not being unkind to B Corp. PCI DSS. The most ridiculous thing is, why do browsers not intervene when you're entering your credit card into a website because the site isn't PCI DSS compliant? There is no way to test PCI DSS compliance. Occasionally people release a PDF on their site saying that we've got PCI DSS compliance. The version 4 point whatever it is at the moment is requesting that organizations do a lot more audit. That's a lot more expensive to monitor the scripts that run on the page alongside the payment gateway scripts. That just shows that PCI DSS do not know how modern web pages are constructed.
Okay, sorry, I lost the connection there for a moment. I hope that didn't affect anybody else. Look, I think there's a lot of good thoughts there. Can I suggest, because I'm just also keeping an eye on the time, let's sort of maybe draw a line there and ask people, could you reflect on this? and then sort of reach out to Colin with your comments and suggestions, because it feels like there's a kernel of a good idea here and some feedback and input by the
Just
sound.
what I would,
Very timely.
after some expert opinion and views, I've been struggling to get that. Yeah. So thank you.
Brilliant. Well, thank you for that. Yeah, a lot of food for thought. Right, let me then completely change tack. As I say, apologies for dropping off there momentarily. For some reason, my connection was playing up. But yeah. Right, so I'm just going to briefly highlight a few other things that happened in the last week or so. And there was a lot of stuff over the last week, so I am going to cherry pick a few things. So these are in the order they were from the sort of news headlines email, but as you'll see, as always, I'll skip over quite a few of them. But these first two definitely, I think, warrant a mention. So firstly, news that the amount of content that's being blocked from access within Russia has expanded. Most recently has encompassed a range of sites, including YouTube, WhatsApp, I think also Telegram, surprisingly, given some of the usage of Telegram. So I'm not sure if that's the entirety of Telegram or just some of the shared channels. And there's a sort of explanation about the requirements from the Russian regulator in the article that this links to, as well as a few other sort of linked stories as well. So I think that's definitely worth a read. And I think it builds on a suggestion last week about the sort of fragmentation of the global naming system. Coincidentally, I think this is maybe an example of that in a very sort of niche case, but it does underline the benefits of having a single consolidated global naming system. Also, Forbes had a list of the 10 best domain registrars of the year, quite early in the year, in my view, for that. But anyway, slightly strange listing in many ways. Some fairly superficial criteria mentioned at the top of the article, and then you had to sort of dig down to find mention of things like DNSSEC and other stuff. And then if you read sort of further down, you'll see that most of the sort of customer ratings of the recommended registrars were, I think, neutral. Some were low, some were slightly better than, I think satisfactory was the highest rating, so they weren't exactly glowing. So it's surprising that those were the top few offerings. And there was no real consideration of things like the downsides of stuff like bulk registration features when it comes to DNS abuse, and no consideration about whether they had know your customer processes in place. So interesting article, I think a bold position to take, but I think room for improvement without taking a view as to the 10 registrars in particular. But there you are. Other stuff, just as I say, I'll skip over quite a few of these, but Andy Newton of ICANN sort of shared his thoughts in the APNIC blog on the current state of RDAP, since WHOIS was mentioned just now. Just looking at the take-up and the sort of volume of RDAP queries by both GTLDs and also CCTLD communities. Bear in mind the latter group, you may or may not know, don't have to use RDAP. It's mandatory, I think, for those with ICANN contracts, but CCTLDs are outside of that. But interesting, nevertheless, to see the level of take-up. That's a topic we sort of touched on this call probably a year or so ago, when it was WHOIS was being sunsetted and RDAP was the new thing coming in. There's a sort of interesting piece from CSC on domain security report, looking at the global 2,000 companies. Are they doing enough on domain security? It showed quite a high usage, a growing and high usage of DMARC, growing but still low usage of DNSSEC, but a reduction in the amount of DNS redundancy, which he rightly highlights. That's despite regulatory pressures to have improved DNS redundancy. It's actually gone in the opposite direction, despite things like the recent introduction of the NIS 2 regulations, which was a surprise. Other things, the draft agenda for the ITF 125 meeting came out on Friday. It will change or could change over the next week. So, but it's if you like a first indication of what's likely to be on the agenda, albeit the running order may well change. And then I think finally the one I mentioned, again, quite an interesting piece for in the ExpressVPN blog on encrypted SNI, or at least it calls it encrypted SNI. At the start of the article, it explains it morphed into encrypted client hello partway through, and it looks at some of the pros and cons of it. It's quite a good article in my view. Some of it maybe could be improved, but I was surprised to see quite a lengthy post in there, so that's worth a look. And I think that was probably it. Yeah, and then other sort of random stuff, not really DNS at all related. There was a mention that the Albanian government faces a legal spat with the actor, who apparently their AI minister was modelled on. How very modern to have a spat for the AI minister. We talked about that, I think, a couple of months ago. And then a couple of other pieces. For example, fake job recruiters are hiding malware in developer coding challenges. If you use the summarize with AI button, it may be lying to you. There could be malware lurking underneath that. And also, some of the malicious actors are actually using snail mail to aid in their crypto theft attacks. So there's a number of different stories there, largely about how to exploit human weaknesses to bypass security in a variety of creative ways, which is slightly depressing. Perhaps more positively, a few deadlines coming up. So today, if you want to apply for youth TIG, or you know someone that does, I think today is the deadline for that. Tomorrow is the deadline for OARC 46 early bird registrations, and RIPE 92 is later this week as well. So you've got a couple of those coming up, and in the middle is the deadline for applications for a range of ICANN leadership positions. And then there's other stuff, obviously, in due course, which we won't go on about, but things coming up. I should mention, as it's a sort of newly arrived, if you want to present at nog.fi, so the Finnish nog, they've just announced a call for presentations with a deadline in early May, just towards the bottom of the slide there. And then finally, a whole bunch of sort of different conferences, as you can see, Morg running at the moment. Eurodig got planning meeting tomorrow, various other bits and pieces, and we're not so far from ICANN 85, the RSA conference, ITF 125, etc. So there's a lot of stuff in March, but a few things coming up before that. And then finally, from me, just keeping an eye on the time. Next week, I'll just briefly talk about some of the content of the forthcoming RSA conference in San Francisco. And then the sort of following 2 weeks, I will probably talk about ICANN 85 and then ITF 125 agendas, but possibly with a few other things coming onto those calls as well. I'm just waiting for a few people to confirm. So it may be a sort of mixture of topics for the next few calls, but it just gives you a heads up. We'll at least be talking about those things. So that's it from me. So let me stop sharing. and just pause and see if anyone has anything else that you want to mention in the last couple of minutes. Conscious that between Colin and I we've done a lot of talking, so anyone else want to come in with anything, you're welcome to do so. I'm not seeing anyone unmuting, and I don't see anything else in the chat since it unfroze. Oh. Okay, all right, well look, just coming up to the hour, so let's draw a line there. Colin, thank you again for a thought-provoking presentation, and I'm sure people will be in touch. In fact, I know someone got in touch with you even before the call, so just to really preempt things before you even...
Thank you very much for listening.
But, yeah, appreciate your presentation. Hope that was useful, everyone. Have a fantastic week, as always, and look forward to catching up next week, talking about the RSA conference and probably other matters. So see you all then. Bye all.